My father once looked straight into my eyes in our living room that night and decided I meant nothing to him. My name is Angela, and I was 24 years old when I learned that family does not always mean you belong. He stood so close that I could smell coffee on his breath. His hands were shaking. His voice was loud enough to make the walls feel smaller. He did not speak quieter. He did not stop. He did not look away. "Get out, you low life!" he shouted. The room went silent in a way that felt heavier than sound. I did not cry. I did not explain myself. I did not ask him to take it back. I just looked at him, nodded slowly, and said the only words that felt honest in that moment. "Thank you for being honest." I walked past him without touching anything, without grabbing clothes, without taking photos, without looking at the furniture where I grew up. I did not slam the door. I did not shout back. I did not ask my mother to stand up for me. I walked out as if I had already said goodbye years ago. What he never knew was that my paycheck had already reached 7 figures. My life no longer needed his approval. My silence was not weakness. 1 week later, everything changed silently. The paperwork was done. The keys changed hands. A single legal envelope arrived with a clear deadline that no one expected. Comment where you are watching from and what time it is there, so I can understand how far the story has traveled emotionally. Looking back, my childhood never felt safe. It just felt silent. My father Thomas controlled every decision inside our home, and he never explained why things had to be that way. He did not raise his voice often, but when he did, the air felt tight enough to make breathing feel like a mistake. Even when he was calm, he watched everything, measured every movement, and made it clear that respect meant obedience. My mother, Evelyn, learned how to survive by becoming invisible whenever tension filled the room. She did not argue. She did not challenge, and she rarely spoke unless she was spoken to. I watched her carefully because she was my first lesson in how silence could be used as protection and how peace was sometimes built by swallowing your own thoughts. My older brother Kevin was always treated like the future of the family, and his mistakes were softened before they could ever grow sharp. If he failed, reasons were found. If he forgot, excuses were made. If he broke something, it became an accident that no one held against him. I stood beside him during those moments and learned that some people were allowed to fall without consequences. My older sister Natalie was wrapped in comfort so tightly that even her sadness was handled gently. When she cried, the room shifted. When she felt overwhelmed, the world slowed down for her. I noticed how quickly hands reached out to fix her problems, and how quickly patience appeared whenever her name was spoken. When I made small mistakes, they felt large in that house. A glass left in the sink became a lecture. A wrong answer turned into a long silence at the table. A hesitation in my voice brought disappointment that sat heavy in my chest. I was compared without warning, and the comparison stayed in the air longer than the words that caused them. I learned how to make myself smaller without being asked. I learned how to think quietly before speaking, and how to swallow words before they could create trouble. I started answering questions with shorter sentences because longer ones felt dangerous. I studied faces before talking, learning exactly when it was safe to exist without being corrected. There were dreams I never shared, not because I did not have them, but because sharing felt like opening a door that would be slammed shut. I learned how to smile without meaning it and how to nod even when I did not understand. The quiet became normal to me, and the silence stopped feeling strange. Over time, I stopped expecting comfort from inside that house. I stopped waiting for someone to ask how I felt. I stopped believing that my thoughts deserved space. I carried everything inside because it felt safer than allowing it to be picked apart. By the time I was old enough to recognize what was happening, silence had already shaped the way I existed. I did not know how to ask for warmth because I had grown inside cold walls. I did not know how to trust attention because attention had always come with conditions. And without realizing it, I became someone who learned to disappear while standing right in the middle of the room. A few years later, I understood that staying meant disappearing. I left quietly, not because I was brave, but because staying felt like slowly erasing myself. I carried very little money, a small bag of clothes, and a tired understanding that no one inside that house would try to stop me. There was no goodbye scene, no big conversation, and no arms reaching for me when I walked out through the front door. My first room was cheap enough to feel temporary, yet expensive enough to scare me. The walls were thin. The mattress was old. The air never felt warm, but it was mine. I learned quickly that survival did not come from comfort. It came from discipline. I worked late shifts, cleaning offices, stacking shelves, sorting inventory, and taking any job that paid fast. Some weeks I changed workplaces so often that I stopped remembering the names of the managers. Money stayed tight, but I stopped expecting it to feel easy. I learned how to stretch meals, how to count every bill, and how to walk past things I wanted without slowing down. At night, I came back to my small space with tired hands, sore shoulders, and a mind that never fully rested. Sleep came in short pieces, yet waking up without shouting voices felt like a kind of freedom. What surprised me most was not the struggle, but the silence from home. No calls, no messages, no questions. There was no curiosity about where I went or whether I was safe. No one tried to find me. No one tried to change my mind. That quiet absence hurt more than anger would have because it confirmed what I had always felt but never wanted to believe. I moved through different low-level jobs quickly, not because I was careless, but because I was searching for something that made sense to me. I worked in kitchens where heat burned my hands. I worked in warehouses where the air felt heavy on my chest. I worked in customer service where smiling felt like another form of labor. Each place taught me what I did not want my future to look like. One night, a temporary agency placed me in a small data center that needed overnight staff to monitor equipment. It was not impressive. It was not famous. It was a quiet room filled with machines that hummed instead of shouted. For the first time, I felt calm while working. I was given simple tasks at first, mostly watching panels, checking temperatures, and recording logs. I did not know much about technology then, but I felt drawn to the order of it. I started asking quiet questions. I stayed after shifts to learn how basic systems worked. I watched how cables connected, how servers responded, and how problems were solved without anyone raising their voice. No one treated me like I was in the way. No one made me feel small for not knowing enough yet. For the first time, learning felt safe instead of dangerous. The more time I spent around those machines, the more I felt something shift inside me. I realized that technology did not judge where I came from. It only responded to what I could do. I began to imagine a future that did not depend on being approved by people who never saw my worth. I did not call home to share any of this. I did not feel the need to update anyone who had chosen silence first. I focused on building something quietly, one skill at a time, one shift at a time, one small decision after another. Leaving that house did not make my life easy, but it made it honest. I was no longer disappearing. I was becoming someone I could live with. Years passed quietly, and something inside me started to harden. I stopped thinking of survival as a temporary condition and started treating it like a foundation that needed to be reinforced every single day because I finally understood that no one was coming to rescue me if I collapsed. I began to see knowledge as something practical rather than something impressive. And I chose cybersecurity because it felt honest in a way other paths never had. It was silent work demanding focus rather than applause, which suited someone who had grown up learning not to take up space. I studied alone for long hours, not because I enjoyed isolation, but because I had become comfortable building strength without witnesses. I learned how systems failed, not through textbooks alone, but through slow observation of real mistakes that companies never talked about publicly. I spent evenings watching conferences that felt like conversations meant for people who already belonged, sitting close enough to understand but far enough to remain invisible. My early projects had no famous names attached to them, and there were no awards, no recognition, no mentors guiding my hands, only quiet progress measured in skills that slowly became reliable. The first rejections came before my confidence had fully formed, which almost saved me because I had nothing fragile to lose. Companies saw potential but refused to take a risk. Recruiters praised my effort while quietly ignoring my applications, and emails of polite refusal started to feel routine rather than painful. I kept working because stopping would have meant returning to the version of myself that once believed silence was safety, and I refused to fall back into that shape. Over time, the projects grew more complex, not because I chased larger challenges, but because I stopped doubting whether I deserved them. I began to understand the patterns hidden inside networks, the quiet signals that showed where defenses were weak, and the small details that separated a careless protection system from a strong one. My income stabilized slowly without dramatic jumps or lucky breaks, and the stability itself felt foreign at first, like wearing a coat that did not quite match my body. I learned to budget without fear, to sleep without calculating disasters, and to walk into grocery stores without memorizing prices before touching anything. When the money became consistent, something unexpected happened inside me. I stopped thinking only about how to stay alive, and I started wondering what I could build, what I could support, and who I could protect. I thought about my family, not with pain, but with distance that felt calm rather than bitter. For the first time, I realized that if they ever needed help, I would be capable of offering it without sacrificing myself in the process. That realization did not feel like revenge, and it did not feel like victory. It felt like balance. I no longer worked to prove anything, not to strangers, not to former classmates, not even to the versions of my parents that existed inside my head. I worked because I had created a life that no longer depended on permission, and because the skills I built belonged to me in a way nothing else ever had. I began to believe that my story was not about being rejected, but about becoming untouchable in quiet ways that could never be taken from me. At that point, helping my family stopped being a fantasy and started looking like a real option that I was finally strong enough to choose rather than beg for. One afternoon, the truth found me instead of the other way around. I was not searching for my family that day, not digging into old memories, not trying to reopen doors I had spent years locking from the inside. My life had finally reached a point where distance felt like stability instead of loneliness, where silence felt like protection rather than punishment, and where my focus belonged only to the world I had built by myself. That afternoon began quietly, almost forgettably, with a conversation I assumed would stay shallow and meaningless until a familiar name slipped into the air from someone who had no emotional connection to my past. He was not a relative, not a neighbor, not someone who cared where I came from or where I was going. But he had once done business with my father and carried no reason to invent stories or soften reality. He spoke without hesitation and without trying to sound dramatic, telling me that my father had used the family house as collateral to secure a loan that was far beyond what could be handled calmly. It was not a small agreement. It was not temporary pressure. It was the kind of debt that grows quietly while families pretend everything remains stable. He explained that legal paperwork already existed and that the agreement had been signed months ago, which meant the situation was not accidental or recent, but planned and hidden. In that moment, something shifted inside me that did not feel like anger or fear, but something closer to a harsh kind of clarity that could not be ignored. I realized that my parents had been carrying this weight in silence, smiling through conversations, answering phone calls normally, sitting at family tables, pretending the ground beneath them was still solid. They chose to protect how they looked to the world instead of admitting they were sinking deeper every day. What hurt me most was not the size of the debt, but the way they chose to handle it, because I understood that the secrecy was not about protecting the family, but about protecting pride. I had spent years building a life without them, learning how to survive without approval, permission, or attention. Yet hearing that they were collapsing quietly pulled at a part of me I believed had gone numb. I began to wonder what it would mean if I stepped forward now, not as a rejected daughter, not as the child who was pushed away, but as a woman who had built something real. I imagined what it would feel like if they finally looked at me and saw value instead of disappointment, if they saw strength instead of failure, if they admitted that I had become someone they never expected. The thought grew heavier the longer I sat with it, because what I wanted was not revenge, not control, not satisfaction, but recognition, something simple that I had never been given when it mattered most. I wanted them to see me as someone who could stand beside them, not beneath them. And I allowed myself to believe, for a brief, dangerous moment, that helping them might finally heal what had broken a long time ago. By the end of that day, I had already made a quiet decision, one that felt risky and hopeful at the same time, because I convinced myself that going back could be the moment they would finally accept me as their daughter instead of their mistake. That night, I waited outside the door, believing too much. I stood there longer than I should have, not because fear kept me frozen, but because hope had quietly grown inside me despite every warning I tried to give myself. I told myself again and again not to expect kindness, not to imagine apologies that had never existed, not to picture relief that was never promised. Yet my hand trembled slightly when I reached for the handle, as if my body remembered a warmth that my mind refused to trust. The door opened without ceremony, without curiosity, without even the smallest trace of surprise, and the living room appeared exactly as I remembered it, carefully controlled, almost untouched by time, yet filled with a silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful, a silence built on unspoken rules. No one asked why I had come. No one spoke my name. The air wrapped around me in a way that made my presence feel invisible. Mom remained seated, lowering her eyes almost immediately, choosing to study her hands instead of acknowledging my face, and I searched her expression for something familiar, something protective, something human, hoping to find a crack in the surface that had not been there before. She did not move, not even when I stepped closer than I had in years. I had rehearsed the scene in my mind countless times, imagining hesitant smiles, careful questions, maybe even awkward concern, but what I faced instead was a distance so polished that it felt intentional, almost practiced. I sat down slowly and began to speak, keeping my voice steady even though my chest felt heavier with every word. I explained that I knew about the financial strain, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as something spoken with quiet understanding, a way of letting them know that I saw the pressure they were trying so hard to hide. I told them I understood how debt could turn a home into a silent trap, where every wall listened, where every sound felt like judgment. And I shared that I had reached a place in my own life where offering help did not come from pity, pride, or a need to prove anything, but from a simple desire to stop everything from breaking beyond repair. For a brief and dangerous moment, I believed I had reached them. Dad rose from his chair, so suddenly that the shift in the room felt violent even before his voice filled the space. "Get out, you lowlife!" The words crossed the room before I could react, and even though they hit the walls first, I felt them land in my chest like a blow that knocked the air from my lungs, leaving a hollow ache that spread before I could gather myself. He stepped closer, his face burning with something sharp and uncontrollable, his jaw tight, as if holding back even more that he refused to let spill. "You're making me look weak." That sentence cut deeper than the first because it had nothing to do with money and nothing to do with misunderstanding, revealing instead that what truly frightened him was not the situation itself, but the image he felt slipping from his hands. I turned to Kevin, not searching for protection, not looking for a rescue, but hoping for the smallest sign that I was not completely alone in that room. Yet he slowly looked away, his movement deliberate, quiet, final, in a way that said more than words ever could. I turned to Natalie, whose silence felt even heavier because it carried no hesitation, no conflict, no visible uncertainty, only a quiet decision to remain on the other side of the distance between us. In that moment, the room felt smaller around me, not because the walls moved, but because I understood something I had refused to see for too long, which was that the fragile hope I had carried into that house had never belonged there in the first place. I stood up without raising my voice, without defending myself, without trying to secure a victory in a battle that had been decided long before I ever touched that door. And as I looked at them one last time, I felt no anger and no grief, only a calm clarity that settled into me like a quiet ending. I finally understood that I was not walking away from people who had lost their way, but from people who had never wanted to see me whole. A week later, I stopped explaining myself. I no longer felt anger, which surprised me in a way that was difficult to describe because for so many years I believed rage was the only force strong enough to keep me moving forward. What I discovered instead was that clarity carried far more weight. Once I accepted that no amount of conversation would ever change how they saw me, something inside me realigned. I stopped chasing their approval and began constructing a version of life that no longer required their permission to exist. That morning, I walked into the office of my lawyer, Jason Miller, who had been quietly recommended to me through a former client that valued confidentiality more than conversation. Jason did not ask emotional questions, and he did not perform sympathy like a script. He listened carefully, opened his laptop, and treated my situation as a structure that deserved logic rather than judgment, which marked the first time I felt genuinely respected inside a professional space. We began by reviewing the legal standing of the house, and I watched his focus settle into the details as his eyes moved across financial records, court databases, contracts, liens, and documentation that most people would never notice unless their entire world depended on it. He explained every element slowly, so I could follow the logic without feeling lost. The property had been leveraged dangerously. The debt was very real and far more fragile than anyone in that home was willing to admit. My father had signed documents,